I am Wallace, and I'm an alcoholic. It's good to be here this afternoon. It's always good to be on a meeting, and it's especially meaningful to be invited to come to a place in my home state where people know me. I do appreciate Stacy and the committee asking me to come and share my experience, strength, and hope. And it's not always easy for me to do that because, well, Stacy knows, she's heard me talk before. She knows I'm a low-bottom drunk, and she wanted me to come up here to Charlotte. She said that some of you people had never seen one. So here I am. I am grateful for the opportunity to be here and another chance to be with my people. And don't worry too much about the time, because when I sit down, I'm through, and I'm going to sit down and probably a whole lot quicker than you think I will. I try to quit on time and start on time. I just wish they'd have done a little bit more reading today, like the first 5 chapters of AA. AA Comes of Age, Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers. I need to do a little bit more reading at these things. I am Wallace, and I'm an alcoholic, and my sobriety date, February 16th, 1964. And I'm grateful for that. Never in my wildest imagination on my first day of sobriety did I ever dream that Alcoholics Anonymous would play such a magnificent role in my life. Because it's no way, except through God's grace and the program of AA, that I could have come from where I was February 16th, 1964, to where I am today. It's no way under the sun that there's any other journey I could have traveled to have gotten here except through Alcoholics Anonymous, through the help of a loving God, and by having come affiliated, associated, and living with and around people like you. It's the only way I could have gotten here. And I'm truly grateful for this opportunity and for all those wonderful opportunities that have come my way down through the years. And I'm truly appreciative today of the hope that I have for the future. And you're probably looking at me and saying, well, he don't have much of a future left. But I'm only 70 years old. And I wouldn't have been here this long if I hadn't continued to live, quite naturally, and I wouldn't be living if it wasn't for AA. I know that, because I had reached that jumping off place that the big book talks about, was fully committed to doing it, but God in His loving mercy intervened in my life and gave this alcoholic one more chance. And I'll get to that portion of it a little bit later. I'm not too concerned why I'm an alcoholic. I don't know if it's genetic, learned living, whether Mama put me on the potty backwards or what. But I am an alcoholic. And I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that I have been one since I was around 20 years old. I know, too, that a lot of insanity went on in my life once I began drinking, and once I got into Alcoholics Anonymous and looked back on my childhood behavior and the patterns that went on in my life, it was some insanity going on in my life before I ever took a drink of whiskey. And I'm going to have to share with you today some things that are somewhat painful, but it's a part of my story. But I can tell you this from the get-go. I'm not going to take step 5 up here behind this podium. I don't take step 5 in a group. I've taken it with my sponsor, and shared things about my life. And that's the only place that I'm going to share some of the things that went on in my life, because a lot of the things that happened are absolutely none of your business. But I am glad to be here, and I'm very, very privileged to have had the opportunity to walk in the doors of AA and make an unconditional surrender, whereby I would be teachable and able to receive help. I'm sort of like the other speakers that I've enjoyed very much. I was born into a big family. I was born in Roxborough, North Carolina, up on the Virginia border. And if you think I'm talking funny, you should go up there and hear some of those people. I'm from North Carolina, North Carolina, which is up near the Virginia line. And most everybody up there talks this way. I went out to California several years to talk, several years ago, and the girl I had talked with on the phone several times for about 6 months, her and another girl met me at the airport. And when they had a little sign, "Welcome, Wallace, to California." And when I walked up to them, they began to look at each other and began to giggle a little bit, as if, something was going on. And I knew something was up, but I didn't know what. And I says, "What's going on here?" And they said, "Well, we really don't want to tell you." I says, "Why? It's all right. I'm in AA. What is it?" She says, "Well, by having talked to you, we were expecting a tall, slim, black guy." I said, "Well, that's all right. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I'm Irish." Okay. But I am glad to be here, and I'm going to tell you a little humorous story, because I'm shaking like a leaf in a hailstorm. I've never been behind one of these podiums that I didn't shake a little bit. And they tell me it's a good thing to be nervous when you get started. But my friend here from Texas is going to be sharing next, and we were out in Midland, Texas many years ago to share at a conference. And I heard a story out there that I want to share with you, because I think it's funny. And if you've never been out in that area of Texas, all of the little old ladies who have been in the program for about 100 years, they eventually dye the hair blue. And they're very, very smart and intelligent and can recite the big book. And this little old gal had been in the program about 6 months, and she began to have some problems, because one of the newcomers coming into the room was eyeballing her, and she was eyeballing him, and they were grinning at each other. And I really believe she was about to come in heat. But anyway, this gal went to her sponsor and wanted to talk with her about the problem. And this little old lady knew everything. And anybody that's ever read the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous, you know that it talks about sex on page 69 of the big book. Now, whether that's intentional or coincidence or what, I don't know. But it's on page 69. And this little old lady put her hands on her hips when this girl was discussing her problem. And she says, "You go home and you get your big book and you read it." Says, "You turn to page 96 and read what it says." So the little old gal went home and she got out her big book and she turned to page 96 and she began to read. "Do not be discouraged if your prospect does not respond at once. Search out another alcoholic and try again. You are sure to find someone desperate enough to accept with eagerness what you offer. We find it a waste of time to keep chasing a man who cannot or will not work with you." Now, if you're going to quote the big book, you might ought to get the right page because you might get somebody confused. I don't do much quoting the big book, but I know what's in it. I know that the solution to my problem is in it. And I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that if I had not got involved in the solution to my problem, I would have been dead a long, long time ago. I certainly had no intentions of becoming an alcoholic when I was growing up in Roxborough, North Carolina. I was born into a family of 6 boys and 6 girls. I'm the baby boy. Mom and Dad worked in the cotton mills. They were very poor. And when I was about 5 years old, we moved out onto the farm. Some of my older brothers and sisters had already left home. They had stayed home until they were 21. And we were out on the farm sharecropping, working for other people. And if you don't know what a sharecropper is, it's when you work on halves. You have to give half to the landlord, and in some cases, he takes almost the other half. And that's the way we worked and survived until I was up about 9 years old. My daddy got enough money together to buy his first farm. I didn't like farming, and I didn't like the responsibilities I had around home, doing all the chores, cutting firewood, having to go to the well, bring the water in the house. There was no inside John. I was a little John way out in the edge of the bushes, and it was a one-hole John. Some people lived in luxury. They had 2-hole Johns. But we'd have to go out there in cold weather and draw that water up out of the well, and I had to cut the wood and for the kitchen cook stove and for the heater. And later on, we got coal, and I'd have to bring that in. I didn't like doing those chores, but I had to do them. And in the spring and fall, I would miss a lot of work, a lot of school, because I'd be working on the farm. We'd have to put the crops out in the spring, and we'd have to put the crops out, take the crops in the fall. And I missed a lot of school. But I did okay in school up until the 8th grade. But I certainly didn't like all of the hard work that I was doing on the farm. And I had feelings about my life when I was a kid. You see, I was real skinny, and I felt that I was awkward and backward and less than. And I knew as a kid that Santa Claus resented us. The kids down the road would get nice bicycles, ball gloves, and toys and so forth, and we would get a little small 25-cent toy or a couple of apples and oranges, and that would be it. And I learned to resent Santa Claus at a very early age. And when I found out who Santa Claus was, that resentment was turned toward my parents because I felt they didn't love us the way the other kids loved their kids. Other parents loved their kids. And I had those feelings. I wanted to be down at the golf course caddying on weekends, making a little money. I wanted to be down there during the week, during the summer months, but I had to be on that farm, and I really hated it. And we lived on the farm until I was 16 years old. One Sunday morning, my father stood up and very proudly made an announcement. He says, when we get this crop in, says, I'm through with farming. He said he had had enough. Well, I was only 16 years old, and I had had enough too. I had had enough for many, many years. And I think that was the most wonderful day, the happiest day of my life up to that point. Because as I sat at that breakfast table that morning, it dawned on me that when we got that crop in, those farm chores would be over with. I probably wouldn't have to slop hogs anymore and unmilk cows. And I knew that I would not have to plow anymore, and I'd always hated plowing. And the mule that I had had to plow was one of the longest, tallest, ugliest, most skinny, ornery critter you could possibly imagine. stubborn. I remember how that joker used to break wind and look back at me and grin. And I said that Sunday morning, no more plowing, and I'll never have to tell another mule to get up, not even if she sits down my lap. And I haven't ever had to do it again, and I have a tiller at home today. Don't want to do any more plowing. At 16, I had a driver's license. I had just gotten it, and for several months there, my father would not let me drive unless I was running an errand with him, or I had to go to church or something like that. Now and then I would be able to drive the automobile. And I really and truly wanted to drive. I wanted a car more than I wanted anything in my life. And my father says, if you want a car, you'll go to work and you'll get it. And I went to work in the cotton mill in Danville, Virginia, was riding back and forth with some other people. And at the age of 17, I got that first automobile. I remember it was an old 40 Chevrolet. And I bought that car and I began riding around on weekends. At the age of 17, I was footloose and fancy-free for the first time. And also of utmost importance at that time was the fact that I had become popular. Popular because I had a car, I had a little gas money, had a few dollars in my pocket, and older boys began to ride around with me and go places, the races and such as this, and those guys began drinking beer. And I sipped a little beer with those guys for the next 2 years. Not once during that 2-year period did I get enough beer in me to feel the effect of it. I didn't like the taste of it. It made me nauseous, and I couldn't understand why they wanted to drink several. I poured out a lot of good beer for that first 2 years. But in 1953, the Korean War was in progress, and I was 19 years old. And I got a notice from the draft board that I was to report for service. And I went down to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, into basic training before my 20th birthday. I turned 20 years old in August of 1953. The 6th week of my basic training, I was on the firing range at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, when the range officer made an announcement, cease fire. And they stopped firing. And then he announced that the Koreans had signed the truce and that we would be able to go back to the company area and have the rest of the day off in celebration of the truce being signed. Apparently the Koreans knew that I was coming. And of course we didn't get much time off time we got back to the company area and cleaned up our equipment and so forth. But we did go down to the beer gardens and drink a little bit of 3.2 beer. And that's not much of a way to celebrate, I found out later on. But I probably drank more of that 3.2 beer that night than I had ever drunk before. Still didn't get a buzz on, didn't get high, didn't get sick or anything like that. November of 53, I came from Fort Lee, Virginia, back to Roxborough one weekend. Came home on a weekend pass. And that particular Saturday night, I was out at a round and square dance, just about a room this size here, maybe a little bit smaller. And I was out at that dance that Saturday night. I had on an Army OD uniform, had a flat top haircut about like it is tonight. My shoes were real shine. I had put some little pins upon the uniform to make it look better. I also had on all of the medals over here that I had earned at the PX that afternoon. And that night, I'm standing at the heater over in the corner, looking over toward the door, and I'm watching other people laugh, talk, dance, have a good time. And I was doing what I normally did out in a situation like that. I was standing back watching you have a good time. I didn't go up and ask anyone to dance simply because I didn't know how to dance, never felt like dancing, and I was envious of those who could dance. I wouldn't start a conversation with anyone in those days because I felt so bad about myself, my looks, felt so inferior, inadequate, country, uneducated. I just wouldn't start a conversation with you. If you started talking to me, I would talk back a little bit. I don't know how intelligent it was, but I just didn't get involved in a whole lot of talking to people who were strangers. So I was standing at that heater minding my own business that night, just watching other people. And I looked over toward the ticket counter there, the door where the people make their entrance into the dance hall, and then they come on into the dance. As I'm looking toward that door, I see two humongous protrusions come in that door. And I mean, they came in a long time before she did. And she came in that door and paid her $1 or whatever it was, and then she started walking across the floor, and everything was just a bouncing in rhythm. She came straight toward the heater where I was. And when she was coming across the floor, I recognized her, even though I had never seen her before in my life. I recognized her because of stories I'd heard at beer joints and service stations and pool rooms. I had heard stories about her that would curl your hair. And she came over there and was talking to me, and I can tell you I was restless, ill at ease, and discontent. I was really embarrassed because her reputation had preceded her that night, and I had been warned about such activities, even being in the presence of people like that, by my preacher brother. And he was one of those holier-than-thou human beings that had religion, had gotten a college education, and he sort of looked down on us sinners. And I remember how he had always given me these man-to-man talks. From the time I was 5 or 6 years old, he'd take me down behind the barn and give me these man-to-man talks about the bees and the birds, and I didn't know what in the dickens he was talking about during those early years. And I remember that the last time he'd ever given me a man-to-man talk, he had me down behind that barn when I was about 14 years old, and he was one of those preachers that sort of changed his voice when he talked with you. And he told me that day when he had me behind the barn, "Wallace, if you ever drink that white whiskey or play with yourself, you're going to hell." I looked at him, and immediately I knew I had never touched a drop of that white liquor in my life, but I was already in trouble. And I made up my mind he'd never get me behind that barn again, and he didn't. And when I'm over there at that heater that Saturday night, she's talking to me, and I'm embarrassed, and I've been warned about these things, and people were looking over there giggling at me, some of the guys that I knew. And then this gal made a suggestion. She says, "Will you escort me out to the car?" And you know, I'm right out of basic training, and I got my medals on, and maybe it's my patriotic duty. So I escorted her out that door into the well-lit parking lot. Apparently, she thought it was some wolves or something out there, and she might need some protection. So we got in that car that cold November night, and she started that old Chevrolet up, and then she turned that radio on to WCKY, Cincinnati 1, Ohio, that country and western music. And she got it going and then had to reach way over there in front of my knees and turn that heater button and get that old heater going. And while she was over there nudging up against me, she was trying to get me going. And I was a whole lot colder than an old Chevrolet. Restless, ill at ease, and discontent. And I tell you, I was a little bit shook up. And up until that time, my experience with women was sort of like my service career. I had fired off a few good rounds, but I had never been in combat. And we sat there in that car a little bit. She was nudging up against me and saw that I was upset. And she reached up under the seat and pulled out a pint of white whiskey and 2 cups, and she poured out 2 cups of whiskey, and I thought, she must be mighty thirsty. And then it dawned on me that maybe she's going to ask me to take a drink of liquor, and I ain't never drank no liquor. And it was frightening because I had some fear of drinking whiskey as a result of not only what my preacher brother had said, but as a result of 2 brothers who also had some bad drinking problems. Both of them eventually confessed to be an alcoholic. And the one brother that I had remaining, that was one of the alcoholics, died this past January 10th. But I had fear in that car, afraid that she was going to ask me to take a drink. And as I sat there, I thought about the things that my brother had said and what Mom and Dad had said, that it was wrong to drink that stuff. And they'd been warned about getting involved with someone of a reputation like that. But as I sat there and began to think about the possibilities of the evening, and I began to look at her, and I'd look at that whiskey, and I'd look at them, and I'd think a little bit more, and then when she stuck that whiskey out again, I looked back over there at them, and them told me to take a drink. And I poured that Jesse down and tried to act as if I had been doing that all my life. And we had 2 or 3 more cups of that white whiskey there in that car. And we were in that car for only 20 to 30 minutes. And I can tell you that there in that automobile, in that 20 to 30 minute period, a transformation took place in my life that all of my 20 years of existence had not produced. All of the rigorous basic training I had had at Fort Jackson, which had put me in the best physical condition I'd ever been in, never produced a feeling I had within a 20 to 30 minute period in that automobile that Saturday night. I had been afraid when I first got in the automobile, but within a 30-minute period, she asked me to go into the dance because I had become a little bit aggressive. Had slid from that side of the automobile and almost had her pushed out the door under the steering wheel. We went into the dance. We got in the dance that night, and that old fiddle and guitar and banjo started up a medley. And they were playing a song called Boil Them Cabbage Down, Bake Them Hoe Cakes Brown. And people joined hands and started running around that place. And she grabbed me by the hand, and on the floor I went, and I had never been out trying to dance a step before in my life. We circled that room about twice, and I could do-si-do, promenade, lemonade, whatever it was, I could do it. She had on my army cap, she had on my Ike jacket, but I can assure you that Ike jacket was not buttoned up. It was stuck out just like that. People were laughing at us, but I didn't care. I didn't care who was looking or what they were saying. I was having a ball because I knew after getting that booze in my system that those men were just jealous. They were envious. They wanted to be on that floor with that woman with that uniform on, but she was out there with me, and little did I know at the time that she was to be mine, all mine. I can't tell you everything that happened that night, I know that they had to call me down once we started doing the bunny hop. And the bunny hop just come natural to me. I enjoyed it. I got carried away. About 2:30 Sunday morning, I'm back home, upstairs in the bed I had slept in before going into the Army. And I'm laying in that bed about to go to sleep. And I don't want to sleep ever, not ever again. I just want to lay there and relive Saturday night over and over and over in my mind. I wanted to lay there and think about the mountains I had climbed and the valleys I had crossed and how I had grown up and become a man. I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt my preacher brother and mom and dad had been lying to me all their life, telling me that booze was something that would send you to hell. I had been in heaven and could hardly wait to get back and get some more of that good stuff, all of it. I enjoyed everything that had happened. I knew that Sunday morning as I lay in bed because I made up my mind. Never again will I be out in any type of social function without this magic ingredient. This magic ingredient that had taken this boy there in that automobile that night and had changed me from being dumb, country, uneducated, skinny, ugly, backward. I had become, rather than 6'2", 140. I was 6'8", 268. I was tall, dark, handsome, articulate. My hair had gotten curly. My teeth had straightened out. I had become very, very knowledgeable, intelligent, became a good lover. It changed me. It made my world okay. It enabled me to act normal and be like other people. And I had wanted to feel that way all my life and had been afraid to pursue what alcohol had in store for me because of what Mom and Dad and my preacher brother had said. But I knew that that night, under the influence of that whiskey, I had been okay. And I knew that I was going to do it again and again and again. And the next Friday night on Weekend Pass, I bought my first pint of whiskey. And I immediately began having a good times, had lots of good times. In fact, it was 6 weeks before the blackouts began. I began going to jail. One Sunday afternoon, 6 weeks later, some guys at the service station offered me some vodka, and I had never drunk vodka before. We drank that vodka, and the next thing that I knew, it was Monday morning. I was not back at Fort Lee, Virginia. I was laying on the jailhouse floor in Roxborough, North Carolina. I didn't know why I was in the jail, what time I had been put in there, or anything about it. It had been a total blackout as to what had happened. But I had been caught late Sunday afternoon driving, and it was the first time that I went to jail for driving under the influence, the first time my father got me out of jail, the first time he cried about my actions, the first time I was late getting back to Fort Lee, Virginia. And that became a pattern in my life for the next 10 years. Many, many times my father would have to come and get me out of jail. Many times him or Mom would have to send me money to get out of jail, to get out of situations that I was caught up in. I got out of the Army in 55 with an honorable discharge, but I went back in 56. During the 18 months I'd been out, I had been in the National Guard because the little bit of money I got every 3 months would help make payments on a car. I went back into the Army in 1956, not because I was patriotic, not because I wanted to serve my country. I went back into the Army because of some problems. I had charges to be tried on for driving under the influence after license revoked. Judge told me that if I would go back in service, that he'd have those charges dropped. I had other reasons for going back in service. My girlfriend wanted to get married, and I told her that I was in no condition to get married. And she says, the condition I'm in, we better get married. And I tell you, in addition to being allergic to alcohol, I'm allergic to shotguns. We were married, and 9 days later, I was back on active duty. Didn't have a driver's license. Got into Fort Jackson, South Carolina. Went to see a car dealer. Bought an automobile because I went from being 2 years in service through the National Guard. I took a short discharge from the National Guard and re-upped for 6 years to get a bonus in order to buy an automobile, and got the South Carolina license and began to drive again. 3 or 4 months later, I find myself on a ship en route to Korea. And after I'd been out on the water for about 8 days, alcohol got out of my system. And I began to look at my life, how messed up it had been since I started drinking. I was so tired of getting into trouble, so tired of people calling me names, so tired of not having any money because my money was being spent on bail bondsmen, lawyers, court fines, and I just wasn't able to have anything in life other than an old automobile. And was really and truly tired of the problems and the anguish that I was going through. And I made up my mind that when I get to Korea, I'm not going to drink. I arrived in Korea, and for the next 5.5 months, there was no drinking. I enrolled in school at night. I worked hard in the company area. I'd change clothes at lunchtime so I'd be extra sharp. I really and truly impressed the company commander and the NCOs in that company. I had come back into the Army with the rank of corporal that I had made in the National Guard. And there in Korea, as a result of the good job that I was doing, not drinking, going to school, being company soldier of the month 5 consecutive times, battalion soldier of the month 3 consecutive times, I was promoted to sergeant. And the same Saturday afternoon that the Korean Mama-san sewed those yellow sergeant stripes on, I went to the NCO club to buy my friends some drinks. No intentions of drinking, because it was customary around our company area that if you got a promotion or something good happened, you'd buy your friends some drinks. And I went into the NCO club that afternoon and began buying my friends some drinks. And they were happy and having a ball, and they put the quarters in the jukebox, and they'd get up and dance with the Korean girls who had the miniskirts on. And as I sat there looking at those guys and girls dance, realizing that I had been in Korea for 5.5 months, I had not had the first drink. In fact, I had not had anything. And I sat there, and this illness that I have, which I did not know I had at the time, began to talk to me. And says, "Oh boy, you've worked hard over here all this time. You've gotten along well. You've got the respect of the battalion commander, the company commander, and the people you work with, the Koreans. After all this time, you can handle a beer." And I made up my mind that I'd socialize a little bit with the guys, and I drank a beer and nothing happened. Another beer and nothing happened. Well, long before the double shots of old Granddad and Coke were coming. And to make a long story short, about 2 hours later, they threw me out of that club head first, through the screen door. I had become drunk and disorderly and made a fool of myself. That was Saturday afternoon. Sunday morning, I came to in my little room at the compound. I reached over onto the dresser and got a fifth of whiskey that was sitting there that apparently I had brought in with me the night before. And I began drinking that Sunday morning. Monday morning, knowing that I was going on duty, I reached over, I got the fifth by the neck, and I began to drink, not caring that it was Monday and I was going on duty. And it wasn't too long before problems began to crop up in Korea. The company commander did not understand the abrupt change that had come about in my life as a result of my getting promoted, but the promotion was not what brought about the abrupt change. It was the firing up of that alcoholism again that had been laying somewhat dormant for 5 months, but it had progressively gotten worse. I just had not added the alcohol to my system. I got in lots of trouble in Korea for the next several months. Stayed over there. At that time, 16 months was a tour of duty. While I was over there, my little girl was born. I came back to the States in August of '58, went home, met her for the first time, and she was a beautiful little girl. Didn't look at all like a daddy, but she favored me maybe a wee bit, but I hate to put that on her. But it's the truth. She did favor me a little bit. I learned to love that little girl real quick. Mom and Dad helped us furnish an apartment because I told Mom and Dad that my pay had gotten messed up and that the Army hadn't paid me for several months, and they believed it and loaned me enough money to make payment on some furniture, and we furnished an apartment, and I was to come home from Fort Lee on weekends. That was in October of '58. In January, I walked out of that apartment one Sunday night and went down to the highway and put my thumb up. I'm hitchhiking back to Fort Lee, Virginia. And I knew when I was hitchhiking back to Fort Lee, Virginia, that I never darkened the doors of that apartment again. Because I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that night when that tractor trailer stopped to pick me up, and I got into that truck, and he said, "Soldier, why are you crying?" Couldn't tell him I was walking out on a little girl that I love with all my heart. Couldn't tell him that I was walking out on a wife that I did not love. I couldn't tell him that I couldn't be responsible, that I couldn't pay phone bills and light bills and buy groceries and buy oil for the heater. I couldn't tell him those things. And in Fort Lee, Virginia, I immediately went to work at the NCO club after hours as a waiter in order to get extra money to facilitate my drinking habit, because I was living to drink and drinking to live. But my waiter job didn't last very long. I'm taking trays of mixed drinks and beer down the hallway into the rooms where the NCOs are playing cards or whatever it was they were doing in there. And I thought to myself one night as I'm walking down that hallway, how good these drinks would be. So I detoured a little bit off into the toilet there. I took a little sip out of this one, a little sip out of that one, a little sip out of this one, a little swallow of beer, and then I took them on down and collected the money. More long before I had another round to carry down there, and I'd go into the toilet, a little sip out of this one, a little sip out of that one. And you know, when you do that after several trips, the waiter gets drunk too. And they didn't like for the waiter to be getting drunk. They didn't care if the customers got drunk. So I lost that job. And spring of the year was there. And I went back to that master sergeant that was in charge of the NCO club and the swimming pool. And I had a real good talk with him about him firing me from that job, and I wanted some other job, because I had him right where I needed him. I knew something on him that his wife didn't know. I knew who she was and where they had been seen at and how often they were meeting there. And he thought it might be a good idea to find me another job. And he did. He made me manager of the NCO club swimming pool. I got extra money for that for several months. And I'd set up on that guard tower guarding kids in that pool, and I'd have a milkshake cup full of beer. And I'm just glad that no one ever drowned that summer. I began to have some other problems that summer. With that additional money that I had, I managed to save a few dollars, and I got another automobile. I got a Virginia driver's license illegally, and I began to drive. And it was an old boy in our company area from Tennessee and one from Kentucky. And they drank just like I did. We always wore our uniforms because we wouldn't waste our money on civilian clothes. We didn't do much eating when we went out because we didn't have much money and we weren't going to waste what we had on food. But we did do a lot of drinking. And we had that automobile out one Sunday afternoon and we were riding around Richmond, Virginia. And we weren't drunk, maybe 3/4, 4/5, something like that. I mean, we were a little somewhat tipsy, but we weren't blacked out drunk as we had been on some other occasion. But that particular Sunday afternoon, we had already been working on a fifth and had another one in the car. And it came up a thundercloud. And we were up on Monday and we needed to use the restroom. And we saw a dirt street. And we decided we'd go up that street and use the restroom. We went up there and it was a muddy street. And we got out. It didn't bother us that there were houses on both sides of the road. We used the restroom. We made one right there on the street. Got back in the car and went down, started back into Richmond, and when we got to the corner of Broad and Belvedere, which was a very busy intersection, there was a car stopped in front of me at the red light. And I stopped behind him. When he got ready to go through the light, when it turned green, his car went a few feet and it stopped, and it was a new Chevrolet. And he couldn't get it started. And he stepped out onto the street and yelled back at me, "Hey, buddy, will you give me a push?" I said, "Yeah, be glad to." And as I eased up behind him from about 10 feet or so, the mud that had gotten on the clutch, on my foot, had gotten onto the clutch. And when I got about 10 feet from him, it slipped off the clutch and I bumped him real hard. And didn't mean to. And he got out of the car again and walked back there and looked at us and saw that we were about 3/4 drunk. And then he had the audacity to call me a drunken SOB. And I didn't particularly like that. And then he says, "Why don't you knock it out in the middle of the street?" And he shouldn't have said that to me, because I said, "Good idea." And I backed up about 20 feet, put it in low gear, and I tried my best to get him into the middle of the street. I didn't get him into the middle, but I got him part of the way. Then I pulled around him and gave him that Hawaiian salute, went down the street and come back up. And I wasn't gone more than 3 or 4 minutes. The police were already there. Apparently they had driven by. And when we drove up on the other side of the street, I saw his hand fly up, pointing us out. I didn't know that the headlights was turned down like that. They had us within 2 or 3 blocks and charged me with drunken driving and hit and run. That goes to show you some of the insanity that went on in this head of mine when I was drinking. And I know today, and I've known for many, many years, that there were a lot of things that happened in my life that were already in me, but the whiskey that I drink released the inhibitions, and I go ahead and do those things while under the influence. Had I been sober, I would have been practicing the moral teachings that Mom and Dad had taught me about and been able to control myself. But the whiskey sort of released my inhibitions, and I'd act out on these impulses in a heartbeat. And they got me in trouble time after time after time. I began having lots of problems there at Fort Lee. The company commander was tired of all the problems. Before I could be tried on the charges up in Richmond, Virginia, I was caught again on 7 different charges down in Colonial Heights, Virginia. And I appealed those from low court into high court. I appealed the ones in Richmond from low court into high court. And while these things were to be tried later, the company commander was still having to deal with me and my insanity. He was tired of guys complaining, saying that I was coming into the dormitory drunk. Tired of the mess sergeant bringing me to him because I go into the mess halls in the morning and I'd be sick and try to eat and I couldn't. And those guys at Fort Lee at that time were real sissies. They were not at all like the ones that were involved in Iraq. They were not brave soldiers. These guys at Fort Lee were sissies because I could puke just a little bit in the mess hall and they'd get upset. And the company commander would have to, the mess sergeant would take me to the company commander. He got fed up with this. And he began sending me to a chaplain for counseling. And that chaplain counseled with me for several weeks to no avail. He began to send me to a psychiatrist. Psychiatrist counseled with me to no avail. And the company commander apparently found out from the district attorney that when I was tried on those charges, that in the event I was found guilty, I would probably get some time. The company commander then took my record for the past 2 years and put it before a board of officers, and they looked at the incidents I had been involved in. And all 12 of those officers in that room that day, after considering what had been going on in my life for the past 2 years there in service, they came to the conclusion, a unanimous decision by all 12 people, that I had become alcoholically unfit for military service. And they gave me an undesirable discharge. And they rushed that through because they knew the court date was coming up real quick. And I was discharged one day and went to court the next day. And that same day I went to court, I went to jail because they gave me a $500 and some fine and a 90-day jail sentence, and I had the 90 days. I pulled 57 days of it, and as a result of shoveling snow and cleaning the courthouse, the judge's chamber, cooking salty herrings for breakfast and such as this, working all the time, they said they'd let me out at the end of 57 days in the event I got money for the fine. So I talked to this lovely girlfriend that I had, because wife number one and I had been through for a long, long time. And I had a lovely girlfriend back then. Every alcoholic ought to have at least one like her. She was only 19 or 20 years older than I. And she got a loan on the old shack that she lived in, and she came up there to get Wallace out of jail. And that morning, when I walked out of jail after she paid that fine, and I went out to the parking lot where that dilapidated automobile of hers was, and she had all of her grandchildren with her. And I told Ruth that I'd never go to another jail as long as I live. And she says, let's drink to it. She handed me a pint, and I hadn't seen one in 57 days. I toasted the jail, took a swig out of that Jessie, handed it to her. She spit a snuff out, and she took one. The next morning, Ruth was back up there to get me out of jail again. Her brother-in-law and sister from Washington, D.C. had come down to celebrate Ruth's love of getting out of jail. Mac had gotten caught for drunken driving, and just because I was passed out in the back seat, they locked me up. I couldn't even pass out without getting in trouble. But she got me out that morning for $18.75. Then I began to look for some jobs and got some, and I worked on them for a week and didn't like them because working interfered with my drinking. And then I got a job painting and repairing water tanks. And that was a little bit better because I could go out of town and stay a week and didn't have to live with Ruth. And she'd been good to me, but it was sort of hard to live with her. You know, she caused a lot of trouble. I'd come home from painting those water tanks, I'd have money, and she'd steal from me, and sometimes I'd steal from her, sometimes she'd call the law on me, sometimes I'd call the law on her, sometimes neighbors would call the law on all of us, and we were going back and forth to jail and fussing and fighting with each other. And she was no thing of beauty anyway. I mean, from right here over was missing in the front. And it looked like reminded me of a 39 Ford with half of the grill gone. And one of the guys, when I carried her down to the bar, some with me on the weekend, and I mean no harm by saying this, but because I'm no thing of beauty either. But he asked me on one occasion, one of my friends down there, drinking buddies, says, "Why do you bring that thing with you every time?" I said, "I'd rather bring her with me than to kiss her goodbye." But anyway, things got hot down in Virginia, and I left Virginia. Mom and Dad knew where I was, and I went back home and moved in with them. And they said no drinking. For 5 months then, I lived at home and no drinking. And then, during that 5-month period, I met another lady that Mom and Dad wanted me to meet. And we were married, the second wife. 3 weeks after we were married, I went back drinking again. And I was worse than I had ever been before. In January of 1963, after putting wife number through a lot of hell for a year, I began drinking one weekend, and the entire weekend was a total blackout, with the exception of a few memories. She called me on a Monday morning and asked me, was I going to work? And I said, yes. But there was 2 pints of white whiskey under my pillow that morning when I attempted to get off the bed, and I began drinking that white whiskey. And shortly thereafter, my wife began to notice that I had not come into the kitchen, and she came in there and saw me drinking. And she began to say with more authority than she'd ever said before that I was a sorry, no good, low-down drunk, and that she wanted me out of her house and out of her heart and out of her life forever. And she went on to work, and I continued to drink that morning. Sometime later on that day, I went to town trying to buy booze up on the street, and some people testified later on that they would not serve me that beer on Monday afternoon because I was drunk. A sheriff testified that he had seen me on the street drunk at 4 o'clock, but the telephone rang, and before he could come out and arrest me, I had disappeared. Said he only talked on the phone about a minute. And I wished a whole lot of times that sheriff had arrested me that Monday afternoon, because sometimes within the next couple of hours is when offenses were committed that brought about my arrest again the next morning, and no bond was allowed. That was January 21st of 63. And on February the 11th, I was sentenced in Roxborough, North Carolina, after they listened to the evidence, to a period of natural life plus 40 years in the penitentiary. And it was 2 days later I was taken into Central Prison. And there in Central Prison, I knew I was exactly where I belonged. In June of 63, some 4 or 5 months after I'd been in prison, I attended a meeting called Alcoholics Anonymous. And why I went to that meeting at that time, I don't know. I sat in the back of the room. I didn't participate. I didn't do anything. On February the 16th, 1964, I came to in my cell block one night and took a look at where I was in life. I had no future. With a sentence of natural life plus 40, I'd never get out. Nothing to look forward to whatsoever. I had been drinking since I had first gone into prison, the little bottles of alcohol that was being smuggled from the hospital. I had been taking other things that had been smuggled in by free people who wanted to make a little additional money. And I was getting all the influence just as much as my pocketbook would allow me. And during that first 8 months that I was in AA, I made no effort whatsoever. I continued to follow that pattern of behavior. But on February the 16th, 1964, I come to in my cell block one Sunday night and made up my mind that I couldn't go on any further. And I fully made a commitment to go over the railing when the door opened at 9 o'clock that night and plunge 40 feet to the concrete below and end my wretched life. I knew that the world would be better off. I would be better off, because I couldn't get sober. In spite of being in AA, I had no program of recovery. I did not have enough money to get drunk on and stay drunk for as long as I wanted to stay drunk. And that's a hopeless situation for a practicing alcoholic to be in. And that night, just before 9 o'clock, I stood up at the door so that I would be there when this cell block door automatically slid open when they pulled the lever. Some 30 to 40 minutes later, even though I had been standing at that door, as you can tell, I did not go over. God in His infinite mercy looked out for me that night. I came to with my head in the commode, and I was crying and choking and gasping and praying. And the next morning, the inmates who slept next door to me told me that I had cried out that night, "God, if you help me get back to AA, I'll try." The following Thursday night, I walked in the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous at Central Prison, the same group I had been attending for the past 8 months. But that Thursday night, it was different. When I walked in the doors, I had already made an unconditional surrender. I was absolutely willing to seek help. I wanted relief. I wanted a way and means to deal with my dilemma. And I went into that group with a degree of desperation about my life that I still have today. I want to stay sober more than anything else in my life. I can't live in that insane world anymore. I can't afford to. I went into that group looking for help, and it was a man there by the name of Tom Ivester who gave me the copy of the big book that I have at home, the second edition, and told me what I needed to do with it. And I carried the book back to my cell block, and I began to read it. And as a result of getting active in that group, as a result of getting into that big book, as a result of getting a sponsor in that prison environment in 1966, some 2 years after I was in AA, I began to make progress. I got a sponsor in 1966 when I heard him talk. And it was then that I began going through the steps as Tom had told me to do. And I took step 4 and 5 with that Presbyterian minister who had 18 years of sobriety in AA. And I began to walk into a journey that I never ever thought possible. I stayed in all total 18 years, 1 month, 26 days, and 2 hours. I got out in 1981 as a result of having been working with the phone company for several years. I got out because some people had confidence in me, because a male member of Al-Anon had began to call the governor and the lieutenant governor and the parole board. That male member of Al-Anon had begun to get other people to respond by writing letters, and over 500 letters went into the parole board and to the governor's office in North Carolina, telling them that Wallace would be all right if he was allowed to come into the community. Governor Hunt believed those people and commuted that time down to 35 years, and I went on parole in 81 and got off parole in 86. And I haven't let those people down. I built a home, married wife number 3. We have celebrated 25 years this past May 26 that we've been married. She had a stroke a couple of years ago, but she's at home waiting for me now. We love each other. We have a beautiful home. I was able to stay with the phone company for 20 years and then was hired to work with the Department of Correction for 2 years as a counselor in the alcoholic drug program. I'm a member of the Primary Purpose Group in Southern Pines. We're real active in service work. This Carthage that Paul was talking about, I guess he knows a little bit about the Moore County Jail. We've carried the message into that jail for 3 years from my home group, and into prison units, and into detox units. We do that on a regular basis. And I've been active in service work down through the years. Very, very active in my home group. Fulfill the responsibilities that I have in my home group. And if I didn't do those things in my home group, and at the area level and the district level, I wouldn't have any business being behind this podium today. And I know that. And I'm very, very sorry that I talked over time and held you people longer than you should have been held. But sometimes I forget and I get carried away, and I ask you to forgive me. I love you and hope and pray to my loving God that I'll be able to continue this journey with you folks one day at a time. That judge is the one that sentenced me to natural life, whereby he thought that I would be in prison for the rest of my days. That's what he thought natural life was all about. But he didn't know that he was putting me in a situation whereby I'd meet up with you folks. You come into that prison environment and love me and care for me and walk with me and show me what responsibility and decency and sobriety was all about. So in reality, it wasn't the judge that gave me natural life. It's you people. And I love you for it, because I never in my wildest imagination dreamed that life could take on new meaning and provide the type of joy and happiness and decency that I've been able to maintain down through the years as a result of this God-given fellowship, this wonderful way of life that I intend to hang on to for the rest of the day. Tomorrow will take care of itself. I love you.
Thank you, Wallace. And on behalf